When I first started painting, flesh used to be one of the hardest parts for me, and getting those tones right and making skin look smooth and sweaty and look real felt a little out of reach. But after time experimenting, I finally found a simple, repeatable recipe that's easy to follow and works. And in this video, I'll show you how to paint realistic flesh with shadows, some subtle mottling and natural surface finish variation. And I'll also include a few optional extras to push things even further. I'm Nate the Foil Painter, and welcome to the Grimdark Compendium. Welcome back to the channel, guys, and as mentioned in this video, we're primarily going to be focusing on the flesh application and recipe, but I'll also go into some of the other little intricate details as well around the miniature, so you can understand how some of the processes and some of those steps work and all come together. So as I've mentioned, I've been trying out different flesh tones and different flesh recipes over the years, and with this one I think it's one that's easy to follow and replicate, but it also gives some of the best looking results that you can get around flesh. There are obviously some additional steps that you can use and other products that you can use even more to elevate these even further, but I just wanted to primarily focus on this main skin first and give you a couple of different optional extras that you can include or even swap out different color paints to completely change the look of your flesh. It's almost a benchmark for how the flesh can look, and then you can jump in and change some little colors or change your applications, just giving you those options and flexibility to completely change the look of your models. So I have broken down this flesh application and recipe into 4 main categories that we're going to be focusing on throughout this video, with the first being the acrylic layers, followed by some filters and mottling. Then we're going to move on to the unifying washes and finishing up with some special effects. I'll be breaking down each of those categories and giving you all the hints, tips and nuances that you'll need to be able to replicate these recipes. So to start off, this miniature is one of the Jakhals from the World Eaters box set, and the reason I've chosen them is because they've got quite a large area of flesh showing on their bodies, which is perfect for me to be able to demonstrate these flesh applications. And this can be repeated or even added to places like heads, or even if you don't have a miniature that's got much flesh on it, you'll still be able to replicate this process. So first, let's talk about those acrylic layers, and you'll notice on screen that I have primed my miniature in a brown primer. This is VMS Mahogany, and there's no reason for you to run out and grab a brown primer. There are a lot of other brands that do alternative. You could just simply use your standard black primer and then go over it all over the miniature with something brown. Now I only like to prime mine in different colors just because a lot of this miniature is going to have some brown portions on it, and it just helps cut out an additional step, especially when I'm trying to do this for speed. But you can just simply prime yours in black, go over it in brown, and then move on to the flesh layer. Now the reason I have gone for that brown underneath is because this is going to act as our shadows, and it's just going to help build up those flesh colours first of all. So the first flesh colour that I am going to be applying to this model, and this is done through an airbrush, and alternatively you can use or achieve similar results with just a standard brush application. Maybe look at just coating or glazing, something like that, or you could even go on there and dry brush this on if you've got a brush. But I'm using an airbrush, and the reason for that is so I can get some smooth transitions, especially when it comes to skin. I want these to be as really smooth as possible. But now I'm coming in with Citadel's Flayed One Flesh, applied through that airbrush like a zenithal highlight, aiming down from the top towards the bottom at a 45-degree angle. Now the reason I'm building this up slowly is because I want some of those nice smooth transitions between the shadows and the highlights. Now with this color as well, it will go on first a little bit dull down and a little bit like translucent, but as you start to build up those layers and I'm pulling in tighter and tighter, making sure I'm really hitting those highlighted points, you will notice to see that like yellowish tint come through with that flesh. Now the reason I'm not going to go into any like mid-tones or shadow areas with the flesh is because in the next subsequent layers you'll see how we can achieve that with the similar results, but it also helps with those smooth transitions. But I've just worked my way around those flesh areas, not worrying about any overspray or anything like that at this stage, catching those highest points, and when you're done you should have a nice transition now from the brown to a little bit in between to the brightest points being that flayed one flesh, and give this around 10 to 15 minutes to dry before moving on to the next stage. So this next segment now of the filters and mottling is probably one of the most important steps during this flesh stage, this flesh recipe. And the reason for that is because depending on what colour you choose for your filter is going to determine the end results and the temperature and the complete overall look of your flesh tone. So I'm going to use Citadel's Targar Raid shade. This is almost a brownish purple with a slight hint or a slight hue of red in there, and I'm going to apply this exactly the same way as I did that flayed one flesh, but this time in reverse. So I'm going to tilt the model back so that I'm aiming up into those shadow areas, and with my airbrush I'm just going to slowly work my way around with this shade in my airbrush and just firing up into those shadow areas. Now because these inks are semi-transparent, what's going to happen is that flayed one flesh that we've put on first of all is going to slightly show through there a little bit, but because we've got that transition between the browns and the highlights, it's going to get a nice little fade up towards those areas. Now the reason why I said, you know, it can completely change the look of your miniature depending on what filter that you use or what shade you're going to use. You can even use contrast paints in these. So say if I wanted a bit more of like a normal skin tone, this purplish one works really well for the Jakhals because they are sort of corrupted. But let's say you were just painting a standard marine or just a normal miniature though, you wanted some more human looking flesh and that's not corrupted, you could switch out these colours for something like Reikland Flesh Shade or alternatively some other paints. And now if you're wanting more of a red or more of a gory one, you may opt to use something like a red shade, or if you want a cooler one you could go down the path of something like Coleate Green Shade. But what I'm trying to say is it's this filter stage that can completely transform the look. There are some other additional steps that you can use to transform it, but this is the main one, what's going to determine the overall look of your flesh. Now, keeping in line with this filter stage, I am also going to apply some secondary filters to this model. Now, this are just some transitional filters that are going to suggest some sore spots. So for models like this that have got implantations or augmentations, especially his arm where his arm's literally been half removed and a chainsaw attached to the end of it, naturally it's going to be a little bit red and a little bit sore around those areas. So I'm just coming in really tight with Berserker Blood Shade, just aiming at those spots and tightening up the nozzle on my airbrush just so it's nice and tight and I can get that area nice and small. And I start to slowly transition up some sore spots up the arms, around the waist, and any areas where you feel that you may need these sore spots. It's not necessarily going to be on every single model that you paint, but it's just one extra little step that you can add to these areas that are really going to sell the effect that skin is a little bit irritated or a little bit sore. You can go as strong or as subtle as you want with this effect as well. And keeping in line with those filters, we are now going to change the application process. So rather than using an airbrush, we're now going to come in with a brush and use some spattering to suggest some bruising or even some mottling around that skin. For a model like this, where it's a Jakhal and again he's all corrupted, this really makes sense for the colours that I'm going to use. I've used a mix of Coleate Green Shade and Reikland Flesh Shade, but again this is a stage where you can switch things up, maybe go for a purple hue or a more green hue, or even just stick to Reikland Flesh Shade if you're painting something like a a normal human, and this will just suggest some general imperfections around the skin that you do tend to see in real life, and also some freckles and just some additional mottling. A little bit later on in the process, all these marks will be sat or appear underneath the skin, furthermore adding some translucent layers throughout your skin process. Now I know it seems like we've gone over a lot, but even just at this stage we've completely transformed just by these 4 additional steps, and we've got a really nice looking skin. But this is why it's super important to first build up and spend time on those acrylic layers, and without, you know, relying, just putting a primer on there, like a white primer, and then relying on like your enamels and stuff to do the heavy lifting for you. Just by adding a couple of additional steps and the way that we apply them, we can completely transform the look of our miniature. That's why I always try and stress that, you know, spend your time on your acrylics first and then move into the enamels and washes as a complementary stage rather than relying heavily upon them. Moving on now to the third step, which is the unifying wash and the first of our enamel washes. So I'm going to be using Villainy Ink Dystopian Brown for this stage. Now this enamel is designed for a flesh wash application. It tends to have a slightly thicker binder, so you do need to ensure that you are shaking these bottles really well. And we do obviously recommend the use of a Vortex mixer to ensure that the binder and the mixer are all the pigments are all mixed together nice and even. Sometimes if this has been sat in my drawer for a while, I will just get a little stick and just poke it around just to loosen up some of those granules and particles before giving it a good shake. And then what I'm going to do is load some out onto my palette. Now I'm not going to use a wet palette or anything like that. You could either use something like a large Citadel base, or even just some grease proof paper, which is what I've used here. Now I'll load a couple of drops onto that palette. And for this flesh wash, I'm not going to thin it at all. So I'm not going to use any thinner. However, if you do want a bit more of a softer or a subtle one, you could even thin this with just a small amount of mineral spirits. And this will just help the effect be a little bit more subtle, almost like a filter. So I'll load some up onto my brush, and just like I'm going to be applying any acrylic base layer, I'll just come in and coat this over the entire miniature. And you'll notice that it does tint the skin into that more of a warmish tone, and this, you know, this flesh wash is intended to closely resemble Reichland flesh shade, so it's perfect for these types of miniatures where we're painting a more humanoid flesh. But essentially what I'm going to do is just do a nice even coat all the way around those flesh areas, and you will notice that it sometimes flows into the recesses, and I encourage this because this is what's going to give you that separation and the definition. Now once you've fully coated the miniature, you want to give this around 15 minutes to dry. Alternatively, you can come in with something like a hairdryer or a blow dryer just to flash off those mineral spirits and get that enamel drying. Now this enamel, and the beauty of enamels is that they do have longer working times, so this means that even though the paint is dry, it's not actually cured. But when we put acrylics on, these tend to dry pretty instantly and there's nothing we can really do with them. But with enamels, you tend to get around 24 to 48 hours before they fully cure, allowing us to be able to work back off and manipulate that layer. And to do this, what I'm going to do first of all is just come in with a sponge or a Q-tip, and I've not got any mineral spirits on at this point. This is just a dry removal application first of all. So what I'm going to do is just dab away. I'm just using very gentle pressure just to dab away at that enamel. And what you'll start to notice is, because I'm using that dry application, it'll just start to slowly transition off those raised areas, and my goal is to work it back off, leave it into those crevice areas, giving us that nice definition on some of those higher points. But it'll also, because we're using that dry application and we're removing that enamel back off slowly, this will help us get some nice transitions through that wash that we've just put on. So you may have a nice warm bit that comes up and slowly transitions into that flayed one flesh. And this is the beauty of enamels, it gives you that ultimate control to be able to work your way around. And if you do find that when you're working your way back round and, you know, it's been a little bit harder to remove back off, you can just very slightly dampen one of the ends of your sponge or your Q-tip with a little bit of mineral spirits just to reactivate that enamel layer and then flip it back round to the dry side, and again start to work off and smooth out some of those transitions. When you're removing this as well, there's also other ways that you can really control it by dabbing with just some mineral spirits, and that'll cause the actual enamel to dissolve a little bit, leading to more of a mottled effect. But for this one, I just want some nice smooth transitions, and when you're done, I just gave it another quick blast with the blow dryer, and that is the unifying wash done. Now these flesh applications you can also change the color of this to completely transform it. So with the Villainy Ink range, we do have some other flesh washes in different hues. So one of those washes applied this exact same way may also be useful to you if you're wanting a different look to your miniature. With the dystopian brown as well, because it does have that slightly thicker binder in, it's going to dry anything from matte to satin, which is perfect for the start of some surface finish variation on our skin. And what it's going to do with mine, because we've done the dry removal application, it's going to leave a little bit of that sheen and that satin effect behind on the skin, with some areas being a little bit matte, which will suggest like he's been sweating, or some of the pores, or just some general oil that's sat atop of his skin. Now we can move on to the final steps and the finishing touches to this miniature with some effects. Now I'm going to be using Villainy Ink Carrying Crimson first of all. Again, this is an enamel that's designed for flesh and mottling effects, and it leans more into that red hue. With this enamel as well, it does have these tiny granules, or these little pigmented particles inside, and this is intentional. You know, a lot of people sometimes see these and think, you know, it's maybe not mixed correctly, but you still want to be giving everything a good mix. But these little granules and particles are intended for these special effects. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to dot this onto my palette again, and I'm applying this neat. I'm not thinning it or anything like that. This is just a neat application, and I'm just applying this very softly around some of those red sort areas that we did first of all during the filter stage. Now this is going to do two things. Once, it's going to enhance them slightly and bring back some of that red, but because we've also got some of those little tiny pigments inside, it's also going to suggest some more sours and mottling around only those areas. But I just apply a little bit into each one of those sections. Again, allow that around 15 minutes to dry, and then you can come back in with again a Q-tip or a sponge, or even your brush, just to move around some of those little tiny pigments, or even soften and transition out some of those areas around those redness. Now before we move into the final effects, we'll quickly jump into some of the other ways that I painted on this miniature, some of the other parts like the clothing and the metallics, and then I'll show you some final finishing effects that you can add to your skin. Really quickly, just before we jump back into the video, if you're enjoying this video and you want to learn more and dive deeper into the Grimdark Style, or maybe even pick up some of the Villainy Inks for yourself, we've currently got our Valentine's Day sale running right now. So if you feel like treating yourself this Valentine's Day or treating your hobby corner, this bundle does include Villainy Ink Phase 1 set, our anti-death low toxicity thinner, free STL practice blanks, and you can also choose a free course from either Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar, or the Trench Crusade. This is the best way that you can support us and the work that we do here, so be sure to check out the grimdarkcompendium.com for some of our other bundles and Villainy Ink deals. And with all that said, let's jump back into the video. I'll briefly go over some of the other parts that I did paint on this miniature, and starting off with the metallics. Now I did want a rusty undertone for these, as this guy's probably been having these weapons for a long time and they're all corrupted, and it probably doesn't really look after them. So this is why I've opted for a rusty base coat. So we've got that brown on there first of all, and then I've just got a slightly warmer orangey brown, and I'm just stippling and dry brushing this on to those metallic areas. And now what this will do is, when we dry brush our metallics over them, it'll cover most of it up, but leave some showing through and also in the recesses to suggest some rust, and it's just a corroded metal. So I'll load up some Iron Warriors first of all as my first of the dry brushing for the metallics, and I just dry brush these over all of the metallic sections. And the reason I like to use dry brushing for metallics is because it leaves those deep recesses without adding any additional washers or anything to deepen them up. And because of the dry brushing, it leaves behind these tiny microscopical scratches and marks, which is perfect for a beaten up tool that's starting to corrode like this. Now, just to add some highlights or just to make other areas pop, like the sharp areas of the sword or some of the jagged parts on his chainsword, I just came in with the Vallejo Silver as an additional brighter metallic only on those spots as well. Now, if you do want to push your rust even further with these effects, which is what I did with mine, I can then come in with Villainy Ink Sector Rust or Ex Machina, or you could even use a combination of the both to get a little bit of variation. Now, this enamel is more of a rust grime effect, and you can use this on a lot of different areas, but for this, we're just going to be applying it to the metallic areas. And just like we have with the other enamels, this one does have a thinner binder, which will result in it drying a little bit more matte. And if you thin it, you can even get it to go that nice chalky and dust, which is perfect for rust. But what I'm going to do is shake it really well, and because of that thinner binder, you can just handshake these and it'll mix really easy. Then I'll load some onto my palette. And just like I did before, I'm just going to paint this onto those rust areas and just let it flow into those recesses. And then I'm going to come back in with my blow dryer, and you can just let this sit, but I'm using a blow dryer because I want it to flash off really quick and leave behind more of a matte chalky effect. And then if there are any cleanup spots, usually I don't tend to have to manipulate this with the application because of the way it dries, and I just like the effect when it goes on there. But if you do feel you want to remove any, just come back in with a dry removal first of all. And if you need to get some mineral spirits just to take off or remove or manipulate that rust effect any further, you can do that as well. And the end result is a corroded rusty metallic which has got some rust starting to form in the crevices and around some areas. You may have noticed in that previous clip that I did have the skulls painted, and to paint these, this is a really quick, easy method to be able to paint skulls. And I just first of all just base coat them out in any acrylic of choice. This could either be a white, or I tend to go for more of a bleachy tone colour. But if you want to add a bit of variety to your skulls as well, feel free to paint the odd one in a different colour after that. But once you've built up a couple of layers, and you'll notice the first layer that I do, just to get, rather than just being one solid base coat, I want to add a little bit of variety and some like transitions, and almost as though the skulls have got mottling or some discoloration going on. I thin my paint slightly and do the first base coat all over, and because that's a little bit streaky, you can see through it. The second layer that I do to come on to make it more opaque, I actually do this as a second layer, and again building up in this like scratchy, stipply method. And this will just result in a skull that's got a little bit more variation going off throughout it with some discoloration rather than just one solid colour. After that, I'm going to come in with almost a filter like we did with the flesh, and I just gave it a wash of Citadel's Seraphim Sepia, and this was thinned 1:1 with water. If you do want your skulls to look a little bit different, you could maybe opt for something like Agrax Earthshade as well, again to get that variety, but that choice is yours. I'm just going for speed and efficiency with this one. Now after that, once they're all base coated out, I am going to come in, I did base coat the skirt as well, and this was just a very simple dry brush of some blacks and greys, and these were just very roughly marked on, stippled on. And then I even came in with my airbrush just to transition and feather some of those back a little bit. This is again another really quick and easy way to get some texture into your fabric, but also still retain some nice shadows and highlights. But then after this, I did come in with Villainy Ink Goon's Grime. Again, this was just given a really good shake. This is an all-over-purpose grime wash, which is great as a unifying wash on like armor and stuff, but we need to be a little bit more controlled with the application here. And I'm just applying this via brush, and I've not thinned it or anything. This is just a neat application because I'm going to control how strong that effect is during my removal phase and the reductive technique. So just like with the other enamels, give them around 15 minutes to dry, or flash off that mineral spirits with a blow dryer just so that it's dry to the touch. and then I came back in with a Q-tip, just like we did with the flesh, and start to actually remove and work that grime back off those skulls. I did also add a little bit to the lower portions of his robes, or the skirt area at the back, and these you can do the same. This will just simulate, because it dries matte, and I've added some to the base. This will just simulate some of that dirt and grime buildup which would naturally be occurring in the environment, so it would make sense that some of that had creeped up onto his actual robes and skirt. You can also, I did return back to the flesh with the Goon's Grime, because we've got that nice glossy effects of some of those effects with those red mottled areas and the satin skin, but to pull some of that back and add some more drier, more matte, grimy elements, I added a little bit to the skin just under his armpits, or any areas where I think this guy might have been sweating, he's had some muck on him and it started to leak down his body. This is just a little finishing touch that you can add to the skin just to sell the effect. You know, he's been sweating and he's sort of been running around with his top off, and that grime has started to even go onto his body. Now at this stage I'm just going to be covering some final effects steps, returning right back to the last stage that I spoke about right at the beginning with the flesh. And again, these are optional, so it's entirely up to you and if it makes sense to your model. But what I wanted to do is add some wet ichors or some dripping ichors coming from this person. So there's two ways that we can do this. The first way is to just load up some gloss varnish, and this I apply, or you can apply around saws, or just add some streaks, and this will just look like clear liquids that are forming out of some of the holes and maybe some around the armpits as though it's sweat. Or alternatively, you can move to Villainy Ink Ichor of the Damned, and this is exactly what it says on the bottles. These are just black ichors, so this really dark black enamel has got a thick binder, and it will also dry glossy, which is perfect for adding some little oily or mucousy ichors coming from some of the bolts or augmentations that he's had around the body. I also did stipple some of this on to the lower portions of his robes, and because this is black, this will just suggest that he's been walking along and trudging through some mud, which gives us some really nice surface finish variation, because we've got the acrylics which are a bit more satin, we've got those grime effects which dry matte from the Goon's Grime, and then we've now returned with that Ichor of the Damned for some like wet dirt that's still a little bit damp on the lower portions of his clothing. So let's just recap what's gone off in this video so that you can understand each step and why each step and the products that I've used, we've done them. So we've laid those acrylic foundations down first of all. And again, those filter stages are a really important step to the overall look and finish of the actual colour of your skin. And then we've put on there a unifying wash of the Villainy Ink enamel, and because that dries satin, that'll lean more into how flesh would actually look. And then with those final finishing special effects steps, this even pushes that surface finish variation even more to those wet and glossy areas. So you've got some nice realistic transitions now that go from like matte dirt to the satin effects of the skin to those glossy ichors right at the end. And then one final little addition I did add to this, he does have these blood capsules on his back. I actually just went in there, painted them black, and then I actually used some blood effects. So this was actually the like blood for the blood god or any gore effects, and then you can just paint these on and that'll dry glossy as well, giving the illusion that these are like glass canisters. And with that blood, if you've got a guy like this that's been chopping people up, you can also stipple a little bit or flick or speckle some of those blood effects onto that miniature or his weapons. But even though, you know, this video with these few simple steps that we can follow is more of a tabletop standard recipe that we can follow, you can see the results that we're achieving. And of course, there are a ton more techniques and ways that we can even layer on top of these to push things even further with some of the amazing techniques that we teach here at the Grimdark Compendium, you know, such as like oils or the glue technique, to really push things and elevate it even further. But just, you know, from a quick tabletop standard, you can see the sorts of results that we're able to achieve just by really thinking about, you know, how we're applying them, adding a little step, or even just the way that we apply or remove these enamels back off. Again, all these are optional steps, and you do have the flexibility to be able to change any parts of these steps. It's just the way that we apply them in the order to give you the ultimate control of how you want yours to look, which as we spoke about with the filters. You can even change some of the acrylic layers and change even some of the enamel unifying washes that you apply to those flesh areas as well. So I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I hope you've been able to take something and learn something from it. But most of all, I hope that, you know, it's giving you a little bit of inspiration to go out now and try some of the hardest stuff that was really personally hard to me when I first started painting. So I've been Nate the Feral Painter, and as always, I will catch you in the next video.